Nobody told you this. The document hanging on the wall of your courthouse, the list you memorized in Sunday school, the 10 lines you have been told are the moral foundation of all human civilization, was never written to be that. And the strangest part is that the text itself says so, openly, in the very first sentence, and almost no one has ever stopped to read it. I want to be careful here because I am not telling you the 10 Commandments do not matter. I am telling you they are not what you were told they are. For roughly 1600 years, the Church has handed you these 10 lines and called them a universal moral code, a set of rules written on the conscience of every human being who has ever lived, binding on all people in all places in all ages. That is the version you inherited. That is the version printed on the plaques and quoted in the speeches, and it is not the version that exists in the Hebrew text, because here is the first crack in everything you were taught. The text never numbers these 10 lines as 10 in the chapter where they are given. Not once. The name we use comes from a different place entirely, from Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, where they are called not the 10 Commandments, but the 10 words. And even the count is not settled. The Jewish tradition, the Catholic tradition, the Lutheran tradition, and the Reformed tradition all divide these words differently to arrive at 10. 4 traditions, 4 different ways of cutting them apart. Does that sound like a precise, universal code carved for every human conscience? Or does it sound like a label that was placed on the text long after the text was written? Something was done to these words, not by accident. A man whose name you will know by the end of this video took these 10 words, lifted them out of the document they belonged to, and reframed them as something the original authors never intended. And the Church has been reading his version ever since, instead of the one God actually gave. Now, here is what I need you to understand before we go one step further. This is not my opinion. This is not a clever reading. The evidence comes from the structure of the text itself, from the ancient world that produced it, and from the writings of the very era that changed how we read it. I am going to walk you through every piece of it, and what you are going to find is that the 10 Commandments are far more specific, far more deliberate, and far more astonishing than the watered-down moral checklist you were handed. Before we go deeper, if this is already making you lean in, do me one favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single time you do, this message reaches one more person who has carried these 10 lines their whole life and never once been told where they came from. And subscribe, because what we are about to uncover is going to challenge things you have believed since childhood, and I do not want you to miss any of it. So let me take you back more than 3,000 years to a world ruled by kings, and to a kind of document that the ancient world used for one purpose and one purpose only, because once you understand what that document was, you will never look at these 10 words the same way again. Now, to understand what the 10 Commandments actually were, you have to understand the world they were written into. And that world was a world of kings. In the 14th and 13th centuries before Christ, the great empires of the ancient Near East had a problem. A powerful king, what scholars call a suzerain, an overlord, a great king, would conquer or absorb smaller peoples around him. And he needed a way to bind those smaller peoples to himself. Not just by force, because force fades the moment the army goes home. He needed a binding relationship, a sworn loyalty, a legal bond between the great king and the lesser people who now belonged to him. And the ancient world developed a specific document for exactly that purpose. We call it the Suzerain-Vassal Treaty. This was not a vague arrangement. It was a fixed legal form. The great king identifies himself by name. He recounts the history of what he has already done for the smaller people, the rescues, the gifts, the protection he has given. He lays out the terms, the stipulations, what the people must now do and not do in response. He commands that the document be stored in a sacred place and read aloud regularly so no one can claim they never heard it. He calls witnesses to the agreement, and he attaches the consequences, the blessings for keeping the treaty and the curses for breaking it. 6 parts, in that order, every time. Anyone living in that world would have recognized the shape of it on sight, the way you would recognize a contract or a marriage license today. Now I need you to hold that structure in your mind, because here is where it becomes staggering. When you lay the covenant God made with Israel next to this form, it matches. Not loosely, not approximately. Point for point, in the same order, with the same components, the same internal logic, the preamble, the history, the terms, the storage and the reading, the witnesses, the blessings and the curses. Every single part is there, and the timing is its own quiet miracle. That particular treaty form, with that particular arrangement of the parts, belongs to a narrow window in history. It was standard in the late 2nd millennium before Christ, and then it largely faded. The covenant at Sinai matches the form of exactly the era it claims to come from. Not the form of 1,000 years later, the form of the very century the text places it in. So sit with what that means. The 10 Commandments are not a free-floating list of moral ideals dropped out of the sky for everyone everywhere. They are the heart of a legal document, written in the precise diplomatic language of the world that produced them, between a great king and a people he had just rescued. That is not a moral code. That is a covenant treaty. And once you understand that the whole thing is built on the form of a treaty, you can start to read the parts, because every single piece of that ancient form shows up in the text. And the very first piece, the very first words God speaks before a single command is given, tells you immediately who this document was written for. And it was not written for everyone. So let me take you to the words themselves. Open Exodus chapter 20 and look at how it begins. Not the first commandment, the line before the first commandment. The line almost everyone skips on the way to counting the rules. The text says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." Now stop. Before there is a single command. Before, "You shall have no other gods." Before any rule at all, there is an introduction, and it is the exact opening of a suzerain vassal treaty. The great king identifies himself by name. "I am the Lord." That is the preamble. And then he recounts the history of what he has already done. "Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." That is the historical prologue. It is the great king reminding the people, "Here is what I did for you before I ever asked anything of you." And here is what most people completely miss. The relationship comes first. The rescue comes first. God does not open with, "Obey me and I will save you." He opens with, "I already saved you, and now here are the terms of the people you have become." The commands are not the entry fee. They are the response of a people already redeemed. That is the entire shape of grace, built into the architecture of the document, long before anyone argued about law and grace in a seminary. But now look harder at that opening line, because it does something the moral code version cannot survive. Who is God talking to? Read it again. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt? Not who created the heavens and the earth. Not who made all mankind. He does not introduce himself here as the universal creator of every human being. He introduces himself as the specific redeemer of a specific people from a specific event in a specific place. Now ask yourself the question the plaques never ask. Were you brought out of Egypt? Was the person watching this in another country brought out of the house of bondage? The Pharaoh, the plagues, the wilderness. That is not the shared history of all humanity. That is the national origin story of one nation, And the king is addressing the people that event created. This treaty has a named other party. That is not a small detail. That is the doorframe of the entire document. A treaty is binding only on the parties named in it. And the party named in the opening line of this one is not the human race. It is the people God carried out of slavery. Think about how a treaty actually works. A great king does not bind a nation he never rescued on the strength of a history they never shared. The whole legal force of the document comes from the relationship named in its opening line. No rescue, no relationship. No relationship, no terms. So when the king opens by saying, "Who brought you out of Egypt?" he is not making small talk. He is establishing exactly who is on the other side of this agreement and exactly why they owe him anything at all. And the answer is one people, with one history, in one place. Not everyone, everywhere, in every age. So the very first words tell us who this was for. And once you see that, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. What were these 10 lines actually called by the people who received them? Because they were never called the 10 Commandments, and the real name changes everything. Now, here is where this gets remarkable. The phrase 10 Commandments does not appear in the place you think it does. The Hebrew text never numbers these 10 lines as 10 in the chapter where they are given. You can read Exodus 20 from top to bottom, and you will not find a number attached to them there at all. The name comes from somewhere else. Turn to Exodus chapter 34, verse 28. The text says, God wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 words. Not the 10 Commandments, the 10 words. In Hebrew, the Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words or the 10 sayings. That is where our word Decalogue comes from the Greek for 10 words. The English phrase 10 Commandments is an interpretation laid on top of a Hebrew phrase that simply says 10 words. And notice what verse 28 actually calls them. The words of the covenant, not the words of morality, not the foundation of universal ethics, the words of the covenant. The 10 words are described, by the text itself, as the core terms of a covenant. They are treaty language. They are, in the words of the document, the stipulations of the agreement between the great king and his people. Now let me show you something that should stop you completely, because it proves how little we have actually paid attention to these 10 lines. Nobody can even agree on how to count them. The Jewish tradition makes, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt," the first word, the first saying, and combines the prohibitions on other gods and graven images. The Catholic and Lutheran traditions combine the gods and the images differently and split the final command about coveting into 2 to keep the number at 10. The Reformed and most Protestant traditions divide them yet another way. Think about what that means. If these 10 lines were a precise, universal, moral code carved by the finger of God for all mankind, you would expect the count to be obvious, fixed, identical everywhere. Instead, 4 major traditions number them 4 different ways, and every one of them has to do some arranging to land on 10. Why? Because the text gives a total 10 words, but does not hand you the divisions. The number 10 is in the text. The list of exactly which 10 is a tradition laid on top of it. And that is the pattern we keep finding. Underneath the familiar version is an older one, a covenant document, with words called the words of the covenant, given a total but not a numbering, addressed to a redeemed nation. Layer by layer, the moral code framing peels back, and the treaty underneath comes into focus. Now think about how strange that should feel. A universal moral law for all mankind, and we cannot even agree on whether there are 2 commands about idols or 1, or whether coveting is 1 sin or 2. That is not the precision of a code engraved for every human conscience. That is what happens when later readers inherit a total of 10 words and then have to decide, Centuries afterward, where the lines between them fall, the number was given. The boundaries were supplied by tradition, and once you see that, you start to suspect that a great deal of what you were taught about these 10 words was supplied by tradition too. So we have the preamble, we have the historical prologue, we have the stipulations, the 10 words of the covenant. But a suzerain vassal treaty had more parts than that, and the remaining parts are sitting right there in the text of Moses, hiding in passages you have read 100 times and never recognized. That is exactly where we are going next. Now, remember the skeleton of the ancient treaty. The great king names himself. He recounts his history with the vassal. He gives the stipulations. And then he does 3 more things. He commands that the document be deposited in a sacred place and read aloud. He calls witnesses, and he attaches blessings and curses. Watch how every single one of those shows up in the law of Moses. Start with the deposit of the document. In the ancient treaties, both the great king and the vassal kept a copy, and the copies were stored in the temple of the gods, the most sacred place available, because the treaty was sworn before those gods. Now go to Exodus and ask, where were the tablets kept? The text tells us plainly. They were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, in the most holy place, in the very dwelling of God, the most sacred space in all of Israel. And here is a detail that almost no one ever connects. There were 2 tablets. We picture 5 commandments on one stone and 5 on the other, like a list split across 2 pages. But that is not how the ancient world used 2 copies. In a suzerain vassal treaty, 2 identical copies were made, 1 for each party. 1 for the great king, 1 for the vassal. 2 tablets, 2 copies of the same covenant, both kept together in the ark, in the house of the king. That is not a list that ran out of room. That is the legal duplicate of a binding treaty. Now look at the reading aloud. The treaties required the document to be read publicly at regular intervals, so the vassal could never claim ignorance of the terms. And what does Moses command in Deuteronomy? That the law be read aloud to all Israel, men, women, children, and the foreigner within the gates, gathered together every 7th year at the feast, so that they would hear it, and learn it, and keep it. The public reading of the covenant terms, exactly as the treaty form required. Then the witnesses. A king cannot swear a treaty into the air. The ancient documents called on witnesses, usually the gods of both parties, and sometimes the mountains, the rivers, the heavens, and the earth, to stand as witnesses to the oath. And listen to how Moses closes the covenant in Deuteronomy chapter 30. He says, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you. Heaven and earth, summoned as witnesses to the covenant, the very same witnesses named in the pagan treaties of the same era, because that is the form God chose to speak through. Do you see what is happening? This is not a moral code with some ceremonial decoration around it. This is a complete, formal, legal treaty. Every part in place, every part matching the diplomatic documents of its own century. The structure is unmistakable. And here is what makes this so hard to wave away. These parts are not scattered randomly. They appear in the same sequence as the ancient treaties. The king names himself, then recounts his acts, then gives the terms, then orders the document stored and read, then summons the witnesses, then pronounces the outcomes. That is not the order a list of moral maxims would naturally fall into. That is the order of a legal covenant, followed faithfully by a God who chose to speak to his people in the very form they would have recognized as binding. And there is one part left. The most important part for understanding what these 10 words were for, the blessings and the curses, because the consequences attached to this covenant tell you exactly who was bound by it, and they were not attached to all mankind. Now here is where the treaty form becomes almost unbearable in its clarity. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, the great chapter of blessings and curses, and read who the consequences fall on. The text says, "If thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the field." And then the blessings pour out, and they are national blessings. Rain on your land, victory over the enemies that rise against you, your storehouses full, your nation set high above the nations of the earth. These are not the rewards offered to all humanity in all ages. These are the covenant blessings of a nation living in a land. And then come the curses, and they are just as specific. Drought on your fields, defeat before your enemies, siege against your cities, exile from your land, scattered among the nations. Every curse is tied to the land, the harvest, the king, the national life of Israel. You cannot lift these consequences off Israel and lay them on the human race, because the human race does not have one land, one harvest, one set of borders to lose. So ask the question the moral code version can never answer. If the 10 Commandments were a universal code binding on every person who ever lived, where are the universal blessings and curses? Where is the consequence clause for the nations that never stood at the mountain? It is not there, because the consequences were written for the party that signed, and the party that signed was Israel. And notice the shape of the worst curse, because it gives the whole game away. The ultimate penalty in Deuteronomy 28 is exile, to be torn off the land and scattered among the nations. You cannot exile the human race off a land they never collectively held. A curse like that only makes sense against a single nation with a single homeland it can be removed from. The punishment clause itself names the party, a people who had borders to lose. Now I want to show you the rule the people themselves understood, because they did not treat the covenant as a mystery. Listen to what Moses says to that generation in Deuteronomy chapter 5, right before he repeats the 10 words. He says, "The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day." Read that again slowly, because it is devastating to the universal theory. Not with our fathers, not with Abraham, not with Isaac, not with Jacob. With us, with the people standing here, alive, this day, at this mountain. Moses is drawing a line around the parties to the covenant, and he is drawing it tightly. This covenant, these 10 words, this treaty, was made with the nation that came out of Egypt and stood at the mountain, the generation that was actually there. That is not me narrowing it. That is Moses narrowing it. With us, even us, who are all of us here, alive this day. So the addressee is named, the consequences are national, and the lawgiver himself says the covenant was cut with this specific people and not with anyone before them. The treaty has a party, and the party is Israel. But there is one command among the 10 that proves this more sharply than all the rest. One command that the text explicitly calls a sign between God and Israel and no one else. And when you see which one it is, you will understand why this matters for your life right now. Now, here is what most people completely miss. Inside the 10 words, there is one command that the text itself singles out and labels. It does not label it as a universal moral law. It labels it as a covenant sign given to one people as the mark of the treaty between them and their God. And that command is the Sabbath. Go to Exodus chapter 31. God is speaking to Moses, still on the mountain. And he says this about the Sabbath. "Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested." A sign between me and you. a sign between me and the children of Israel. Now think about what a sign is in a covenant. A sign is the visible mark that identifies the parties to an agreement. It is the seal. The Sabbath, the fourth of the 10 words, is explicitly called the identifying sign of the covenant between the Lord and Israel, not between the Lord and mankind, between the Lord and the children of Israel. And here is the detail that should stop you completely. If the 10 Commandments were a universal moral code, then one of those 10 commands is, by the text's own description, a sign given specifically and only to Israel. How can the same list be both a universal code for all humanity and contain a command labeled as the exclusive covenant sign of one nation? It cannot be both. The text has already told you which one it is. It is the covenant sign of a people. This is why the question of what these 10 words were for is not an abstract argument. It reaches right into how millions of believers have agonized over keeping a Sabbath the way you would keep a universal moral absolute. The Sabbath was the seal of the covenant at the mountain. It marked Israel as the people bound to the king who rescued them and rested on the 7th day. It was their sign, and the text says so in plain words, throughout your generations, between me and the children of Israel. Now let me be careful here, because I am not telling you that the moral weight of these words evaporates. Murder is still evil. Theft is still evil. The God revealed in these 10 words is the same God forever, and his character does not change between the mountain and today. What I am telling you is that the form God chose was a covenant treaty with a nation, and that one of its terms was explicitly a national sign, and that you cannot flatten all of that into a generic moral checklist without losing what the text is actually doing. So let me lay out where we stand. The preamble names the king. The prologue names the rescue. The stipulations are called the words of the covenant. The document is deposited in the ark, read aloud, witnessed by heaven and earth, sealed with blessings and curses, and marked by a sign given to Israel alone. Every part of an ancient covenant treaty present and accounted for, which raises the only question left. If this is so clearly a covenant treaty in the text, how did the entire church come to read it as a universal moral code instead? But before I can answer that, I have to deal with the objection rising in your mind right now. Now, before we get to the man who changed how we read this, I have to show you something, because someone is already objecting. Someone is saying, but the New Testament still upholds the commandments, so they must be the universal moral law. And I need you to see how the New Testament actually talks about the Sinai covenant, because it does not talk about it the way the plaques do. The New Testament treats the Sinai covenant as exactly that. A covenant, a treaty, with a beginning and a purpose, and, astonishingly, an end. Listen to the writer of Hebrews in chapter 8. He is quoting the prophet Jeremiah, and he says God promised, "Behold, the days come, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt." Hear those words. The covenant he made when he led them out of Egypt. That is the Sinai Treaty, named by its historical prologue, the exact opening line of Exodus 20. And what does the writer say about it? Read the next line. In that, he saith, "A new covenant, he hath made the first old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away." The first covenant, made old, ready to vanish away. The New Testament does not treat the Sinai covenant as a timeless universal code that can never change. It treats it as the first of 2 covenants, a binding treaty with the house of Israel, now being superseded by a new and better one. You cannot do that to a universal moral law. You can only do that to a covenant. The very language of old and new, first and second, proves the category. This was a treaty, and treaties belong to the parties and the era that made them. And look at how Paul speaks of it. In Galatians, he calls the law a guardian, a tutor, that was put in charge until Christ came. And he says, after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. Until. No longer. These are words of time and transition, not words of universal permanence. Paul understood the law as a covenant administration with a job to do for a specific people, for a specific season, pointing forward to the one who would come. Now here is what I need you to understand. None of this empties the 10 words of meaning. It locates them. It tells you what they were, who they were for, and what they were pointing toward. The God who wrote them is the same God who, in the new covenant, writes his law not on tablets of stone deposited in an ark, but on the hearts of his people. The covenant changed form. The king did not change at all. So the New Testament itself reads these 10 words as the terms of the Old Covenant with Israel, made at the Exodus, growing old, giving way to something new. That is the apostolic understanding. The earliest church inherited it. So how on earth did the church end up calling these 10 words a freestanding, universal moral code, severed from the covenant, binding on all mankind by nature? Someone had to cut them loose from the document, and history records exactly who did it. Now, before I show you the man and the moment, I need to stop for just a second, because if you have made it this far, something is already happening in you. You are starting to see the document underneath the plaque, and that is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to put back in your hands. So do this for me right now. Hit that like button, because every like pushes this past the algorithm, and in front of one more person who has stared at these 10 lines their whole life and never been told they were reading a treaty. Subscribe and turn on the notifications, because we are walking through the places where human tradition quietly replaced what the text actually says, and you do not want to miss where we go next. And if there is one person in your life who loves the 10 Commandments and has never once asked who they were written to, share this video with them. That is not a small thing. That is handing someone back the original. Now, let me set the stage carefully, because what happened next was not a conspiracy in a back room. It was a sincere theological move by a brilliant man trying to solve a real problem, and the unintended result reshaped how the entire Western Church reads the law of God to this day. Here was the problem the early church wrestled with. If the law of Moses was a covenant with Israel, and the New Testament says that covenant grew old and gave way to the new, then what do Christians do with all of it? Do you keep the food laws, the sacrifices, the festivals, the Sabbath, the civil penalties of ancient Israel? The church needed a way to sort what carried forward from what did not. That was a legitimate question. Every honest reader of the Bible still feels the weight of it, and the answer the church reached for was to take the single covenant document, the one unified treaty God gave at Sinai, and cut it into pieces. To say, this part is moral and permanent, this part is ceremonial and finished, this part is civil and belonged only to the old nation. 3 categories. A surgical division of one covenant into 3 drawers, so you could keep one drawer and close the other 2. Now, I want to be fair, because the impulse behind it was not evil. It was an attempt to honor both the abiding character of God and the genuine change the New Testament describes. But here is the problem, and it is enormous. The text never makes that division. The Hebrew gives you one covenant, one set of words of the covenant, one document deposited in one ark. The threefold cut, moral and ceremonial and civil, is not in Moses. It is not in the prophets. It is not in Jesus. It is not in Paul. It was laid on top of the text from the outside. And once that cut was made, one drawer was labeled moral, The 10 Commandments were dropped into it, and they were lifted clean out of the covenant document and reframed as the universal, natural, permanent moral law written on every human heart. The treaty was filed away. The list remained. So who picked up the knife? Who took the one covenant and made the 3 drawers and put the 10 words in the one labeled universal and eternal? History gives us a name and very nearly a date, and that is exactly where we are going next. His name was Augustine of Hippo. He lived from the year 354 to the year 430 in North Africa, in the last century of the Roman Empire in the West. And he is, without exaggeration, one of the most influential thinkers in the entire history of the Church. The shape of Western Christianity, Catholic and Protestant alike, runs through his mind. When Augustine framed something, the Church framed it that way for 1,000 years and more. And around the year 400, defending the Old Testament against a critic who wanted to throw it out entirely, Augustine reached for that knife. He needed to answer people who said the law of Moses had been discarded, and the way he defended it was to divide it. He distinguished the moral precepts of the law from the symbolic and ceremonial ones, arguing that the moral commands remained binding while the ceremonial shadows had been fulfilled and set aside in Christ. Now hear what that move did. It took the one covenant treaty God gave to Israel and split it along a line the Hebrew text never drew. It created the category of a permanent moral law, abstracted from the covenant, standing on its own, binding by its very nature. And into that category went the 10 Commandments. No longer the stipulations of a covenant with the nation of the Exodus. Now the timeless moral code written on the conscience of every person who has ever lived. Severed from the preamble, severed from the historical prologue, severed from the blessings and curses, severed from the sign given to Israel, lifted out of the document and reframed as universal law. That is the divergence. That is the moment the popular understanding of the 10 Commandments split off from what the text actually was. And notice the mechanism. Take a treaty clause out of its treaty, and it stops sounding like a treaty clause. It starts sounding like a timeless rule. Nothing in the words changed. Only the frame around them changed. But the frame is where the meaning lived. Augustine did not do it out of malice. He did it to defend the Scriptures. But the framework he built, the moral and the ceremonial, became the lens through which the whole Western Church would read the law from that point forward. The medieval theologians inherited it. The Reformers inherited it. The catechisms taught it. And by the time it reached you, in your Sunday school chair, the treaty was so completely buried under the moral code framing that no one even mentioned it was there. Now I need you to understand exactly what I am and am not saying, because this matters. I am not saying Augustine was a villain. I am not saying murder became acceptable or that God's holiness is up for debate. The character of God behind these words is eternal and unchanging. What I am saying is that a framework shaped by a man around the year 400 was placed over a covenant document written more than 1,000 years before him, and that framework, not the Hebrew text, is what most of the Church has been reading ever since. And once you know that, you can finally hold both truths at once. The 10 words reveal the unchanging heart of God. And the 10 words were the covenant treaty of a specific people. Those are not in conflict. They are only in conflict if you have been handed Augustine's version and told it was Moses. So let me pull every thread of this together now, one final time, because when you see all of it laid out at once, the picture is unmistakable. We have covered a lot of ground together. So let me lay every piece of it out one final time, in order, so you can feel the full weight of what the text has been telling us all along. The ancient world had one document for binding a great king to a people he had rescued, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, and it had a fixed form: preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, deposit and public reading, witnesses, blessings and curses. That was the form. Now look at the mountain, the preamble. I am the Lord your God. The king names himself. The historical prologue, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The king recounts the rescue and names the party. Not all mankind, the people of the Exodus, the stipulations, the 10 words, called by the text itself the words of the covenant, never numbered as 10 in the chapter where they are given, divided 4 different ways by 4 different traditions, because the divisions were never in the text. The deposit. 2 tablets, 2 copies, the legal duplicate of a treaty, placed in the ark in the most holy place. The public reading, commanded before all Israel. The witnesses. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you. The very witnesses of the pagan treaties of the same era, the blessings and curses, rain and harvest and victory and the land, or drought and siege and exile and scattering, national consequences for a nation in a land. And the sign, the Sabbath, called in plain words a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, the seal of the covenant, given to one people, and Moses himself drawing the line. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Then the New Testament, the first covenant, made at the Exodus, grown old, ready to vanish away, giving way to a new covenant written on the heart, a guardian until Christ, until no longer. And then the year 400. Augustine, defending the Scriptures, dividing the one covenant into moral and ceremonial, lifting the 10 words out of the treaty and reframing them as the universal moral law written on every human heart, the framework that buried the document. So put it all together, every part of an ancient covenant treaty, present in the text in order, matching its own century, a named party, a national sign, a declaration that it was cut with this people and not their fathers, an apostolic witness that it was the first of 2 covenants, and a single later framework that severed the list from the document and handed it to you as something it was never written to be. 6 parts of an ancient treaty, 6 parts found in the text, in sequence, in the language of the very century the events claim to come from. 1 named party, 1 national sign, 1 lawgiver drawing the line around 1 generation, and then 1 man, 1,000 years later, redrawing the line where the text never had it. That is not speculation. That is the structure of the text. The 10 Commandments were never a freestanding moral code. They were the covenant words of the king who rescued his people, and that changes everything. Because if these 10 words were the terms of a covenant, then the real question is not whether you have kept a checklist. The real question is whether you belong to the king. And that question is for you, right now, personally. And it is the most important question any person alive can answer. Now I want to slow down, because everything we have walked through today was never meant to leave you with a history lesson. It was meant to bring you here, to this moment, to this question. And I need to speak gently now, because what comes next is the only thing that has ever truly mattered. Here is the heart of it. A covenant is about belonging. The 10 words were never God reaching for a clipboard to grade humanity. They were God binding a rescued people to himself, saying, I carried you out of slavery. Now you are mine. And the whole story of the Bible is that God didn't stop with one nation. He made a new covenant, sealed not in the blood of bulls on an altar, but in the blood of his own Son on a cross. And he opened it to you, because here is what the law could never do. The law could name what was broken. It could not make you whole. It could show you the holiness of the King. It could not carry you out of your own house of bondage. Only the King could do that. And he did. He came down, The way he came down on the mountain, except this time he came down all the way, into a body, into our suffering, into our death, and he took the curse of the broken covenant onto himself, so that you could receive the blessing of the new one. And now I need to speak to someone specifically, someone who has been listening to all of this, and underneath the history, something has been moving in your chest, a pull, a quiet sense that this is not an accident, that you did not land on this video by chance. That feeling is not anxiety. That is the voice of the God who wrote his name across history, calling you home. He is not asking you to keep a checklist well enough to earn him. He is asking you to belong to him. The way in is not complicated. Scripture says it plainly in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. That is the new covenant, opened with both hands. Confess, believe, be saved. So if you are ready, pray this with me right now, wherever you are. Lord Jesus, I believe you are the Son of God. I believe you died for me and rose again. I cannot save myself, and I stop trying. I receive your covenant of grace. Be my King. Be my Savior. I belong to you from this day forward. Amen. If you prayed that, and you meant it, something just happened that is greater than anything we uncovered today. You did not just learn about a covenant. You entered one, so tell me. Write it in the comments right now, just these words, I belong to Jesus. Not because typing it earns you anything, but because confession matters, and your declaration may be the very thing that gives someone else the courage to come home too, and do the rest. Hit that like button so this reaches one more searching heart. Subscribe and stay with us, because we are going to keep putting the original back in your hands, piece by piece. Share this with the person God just brought to your mind, because the King who came down on the mountain is still calling. The covenant is still open, and the door he marked with his own blood, is still standing open tonight, waiting for you to walk through it into the life that never ends.